We will begin the muscular system with the temporalis. You see the shape of the completed temporalis next to the hands that are working there. It looks like a large comma or cartoon speech balloon. It is a circle with a projecting flattened carrot off of it. Now we will use rust-colored clay tubes to mark the attachment sites of the temporalis. The insertion point is the mandible. Mark it with a piece of your clay tube. The origin of the temporalis is the temporal bone, so create a circular line of clay along the temporal bone. The temporalis's action is to close the jaw. Note, we only labeled the attachment sites. We did not build the muscle itself. Now, remove the markers and slide in the temporalis muscle. If it doesn't fit, feel free to cut it down or to add to it with more clay. The tendon of the muscle, which is the carrot shape, goes under the zygomatic arch to attach to the mandible. Then press the muscle itself onto the temporal bone of the skull. Now we will mark the fiber direction using a wooden knife. You can see how all of the muscle fibers converging at the tendon make a fan shape. The temporalis can exert a very powerful closing pressure on the jaw. If you place your hand on the side of your head as you clench your teeth, you will feel this muscle contract. The sternocleidomastoid consists of two heads. You can see the head's finished shape at the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. Start by rolling out a fat clay tube. There are two heads because there are 2 points of origin, one on the sternum and the other on the clavicle. There is only one insertion point at the mastoid process on the temporal bone. Now take your wire loop and cut the clay at an angle at both ends to create a parallelogram shape. This will be the clavicular head. Now take your second piece of clay to create the sternal head. Use your wire loop to trim it down. It is wide at the insertion, the mastoid process, and then it tapers down to almost a wire at the origin on the sternum. Here we have the clavicular head and the sternal head. The action of the sternocleidomastoid is to flex the neck and rotate the head. Now, use your wooden knife to mark the muscle fiber directions, first on the sternal head. These lines run parallel along the length of the muscle. And then mark the fiber direction on the clavicular head. Now use an extruded clay tube to mark the attachment sites of the two heads. First, we will mark the origin at the clavicle with a clay tube, and then use a shorter clay tube to mark the origin on the sternum. Turn the mannequin model around. We will mark the temporal bone with a long clay tube as the point of insertion. Next, we will mark the mastoid process with just a pinch of clay as our second point of insertion. First, we will attach the clavicular head. Attach the angled bottom along the clavicle and use your fingers to press the clay so that it will stick to the model. Then the muscle will go up on a diagonal back along the line of the temporal bone. Now, use the wooden knife to trim off the excess and use your fingers to press the clay into the model. Turn the model around so you can attach the sternal head. The wide end will attach to the skull at the insertion point, the mastoid process, and the narrow end at the origin, which is the sternum. This is the sternal head. This sternal head will overlap the clavicular head slightly. The rectus abdominis is a long segmented muscle that flexes the vertebral column and is called the crunch muscle. It is the muscle for doing sit-ups. Take a large piece of the rust-colored clay and roll it into a cigar-sized tube. The origin is on the pubis and the insertion is on the sternum and the 5th, 6th, and 7th ribs. Next, roll out your clay tube and trim it with your wire loop so that it tapers at one end. The narrow end attaches to the point of the origin. Make the clay piece about 7.5 by 1.25 inches. Now take your finished shape and attach the wide end of the muscle along ribs 5 through 7 and the sternum to show the point of insertion. Use your other hand to attach it to the point of origin on the pubic bone of the pelvis. And then use your fingers to press the clay onto the model. With a muscle that covers a wide gap, make sure that it is firmly attached to the model so that it won't fall off. Now, take your wooden knife to mark the muscle fiber directions. You will notice that this muscle is segmented. Draw 4 equally spaced lines across the muscle to show the segments. These horizontal lines are called tendinous inscriptions. Then draw parallel lines running from the top to bottom of each segment. The number of segments an individual may have is variable, so they may have 4, like we have created, 5, or even 6 segments. Next, we will build the biceps brachii, which is a 2-headed muscle. Begin with 2 lumps of clay, each about the same size. Roll each of them out into a double-ended carrot or fusiform shape. There will be a long tendon at one end and a shorter tendon at the other end, and it will look like a tube with a swelling in the middle. The two heads are about the same size and same shape. Use your hand to roll out and shape the clay. The origin of the biceps is on the scapula of the shoulder girdle. The insertion point is on the proximal radius. The action of the biceps is to flex the elbow and supinate the forearm. The long tendons will be the points of origin on the scapula, and the short tubes will combine into one insertion point on the radius. Once you have formed your second head, place it side by side with the first and cut the tendon down to the same size. Then press the two bellied muscles together at the shorter tendon side and pinch them together at the point of the muscle. Leave the top two tendons of origin separated. Now we can mark the attachment sites. One is on the coracoid process of the scapula, and the other is on the supraglenoid tubercle. Mark both sites with just a pinch of rust clay. The insertion will be on the radial tuberosity, which is also called the bicipital tuberosity. Now take your combined bicep and attach it to the model. First, attach the tendon of insertion on the radial tuberosity, so the side where the two heads of the muscle attach will be placed on the radial tuberosity. And then, at the top of the muscle, the medial or short head of the bicep attaches at the coracoid process of the scapula, and the lateral or long head lies in the intertubercular groove and attaches at the supraglenoid tubercle. Now take your wooden knife to mark off the tendons, which will be a horizontal line halfway down the arm. Below this line, you can draw parallel lines running up and down the muscle to show the muscle fibers. Above this line is the tendon, and below it is the muscle belly. Next, we will build the triceps. The triceps have three heads. The points of origin for the tricep brachii are the shoulder girdle and the humerus. The point of insertion is on the olecranon process of the ulna. The triceps extends the elbow. It is the only muscle that extends the elbow. We will roll out 3 clay tubes for each of the heads. All of the heads will be in the shape of a carrot. Roll out a cigar-sized tube for the long head of the triceps. This head will be about 3 3/4 inches by 3/4 of an inch. Create a muscle belly or swelling with a tendon coming out of it. Pinch off the excess. Once you have your shape established, use your hand to flatten it slightly. This is our long head. Next, we will create our medial head, which is the deep head of the triceps. Roll out a smaller carrot and flatten it slightly. It should be about 3 inches by 5/8 of an inch. We will take the wooden knife and cut the top of it at an angle so that it will fit on the model. This is our medial head. Now the lateral head is another very simple kind of oval shape. We can roll a short tube and flatten it. And there you have the 3 heads. The medial head covers the posterior surface of the humerus and the intermuscular septa. Take an extruded clay string and mark that surface. The lateral head is on the upper part of the lateral humerus. Mark that with your clay tube, making a small triangle. The long head crosses the shoulder joint, so stick a pinch of clay in the infraglenoid tubercle of the scapula. These are the points of origin. Now we can mark the insertion point on the olecranon process of the ulna, also known as the elbow. All 3 heads will meet here. Attach the 3 heads of the triceps brachii. First, attach the medial head over your extruded clay on the posterior section of the humerus and reaching down to the origin on the ulna. The other 2 heads of the muscle will attach to the medial head and will not reach all the way down to the ulna. Take the long head and attach it to its origin on the scapula and then to the medial head. Finally, take the lateral head and attach it along the upper part of the humerus and to the medial head at the other end. Leave a slight gap between the lateral head and the long head. Now take your wooden knife and draw the muscle fibers. On the medial head, draw 2 lines dividing the clay into thirds, and then draw angled muscle fibers on the outer 2 triangles descending down the tendon. The lateral head has long muscle fibers running up and down it. And the long head also has long muscle fibers with a tendon at the top. So draw a dividing line up near the scapula. The gluteus maximus is the largest muscle in the human body. Take a very large piece of clay and flatten it slightly with your roller. The gluteus maximus's point of origin is on the sacrum and the ilium. Its insertion point is on the proximal femur. The action of the gluteus maximus is to extend the hip. You feel this muscle working when you ride your bike up a steep hill. Use your wooden knife to make 2 angled cuts, creating a parallelogram shape. The muscle is about 6½ inches by 3½ inches. Now let's mark the attachment sites with a tube of clay. Run the clay up the sacrum, down to the coccyx, and up on the back part of the ilium. This shows the point of origin. Now, take a line of clay and just run it down the gluteal line of the femur. Use your fingers to press the clay to the model. Now place the gluteus maximus over its origin and angling it down over its insertion. Use your fingers to press the clay to the model. And use your wooden knife to indicate the fiber direction. The muscle fibers run parallel to each other. The gluteus maximus is a very large, coarse muscle. Next, we will create the deltoid. This muscle forms a cap over the shoulder joint, and we will build it in 3 parts. The deltoid's origin is on the scapular spine and clavicle. The point of insertion is on the humerus. The action the deltoid performs is to abduct or raise the humerus. The 3 parts of the deltoid are 3 fairly similar triangles. Build these triangles and use your clay roller to flatten them. We'll make one larger triangle and cut it into 3 pieces. Take your wooden knife and straighten out the edges of the triangle. Then divide the large triangle into 3 smaller triangles. These divisions create the anterior, middle, and posterior deltoid. For the approximate sizes, see the right side of the screen. Now we will mark the attachment sites with extruded clay tubes. Mark off the posterior deltoid along the scapular spine from the corner of the acromion to almost the medial edge of the scapula for the origin. It will be a thin line of clay. And for the insertion, take a pinch of clay and place it on the deltoid tuberosity of the humerus. All 3 heads will converge at this point. Mark the origin of the middle deltoid, which is the lateral edge of the acromion, and the lateral edge of the clavicle with another small string of clay. Take another pinch of clay and mark the insertion point of the humerus slightly lower than the first point. Finally, the anterior deltoid's origin will be on the lateral third of the clavicle, so place a clay string there. And then mark the insertion on the lowest point of the deltoid tuberosity. Now we can attach the muscle. Take the posterior deltoid and attach it to the point of origin along the scapular spine, reaching to the insertion point on the humerus. Next, take the middle deltoid from the origin point of the acromion and the clavicle to the insertion point, the deltoid tuberosity. Finally, take the anterior head and attach it to the lateral clavicle at its point of origin, and then to the deltoid tuberosity, the insertion point. Notice the muscles do not cover the spine of the scapula or the clavicle, but rather come off the ends of the bone. Now we will draw the muscle fibers. Draw a tendinous line near the point of all three triangles, and then, using your wooden knife, draw angled lines converging at the points of each of the triangles. Now we will build the sartorius. Roll out a very long, slender tube of clay. The sartorius's origin is on the ilium. The sartorius's insertion point is on the proximal tibia. And the sartorius's action is to flex the thigh on the hip. This muscle has to reach from the pelvic bone all the way down to the knee. Trim the correct length to about 10 3/4 inches by 3/4 inches. Flatten it slightly with the roller. Now we are going to draw on the fibers with our wooden knife before placing it on the mannequin model. Draw 2 lines across the very top and bottom of the muscle to show the tendons. Then draw long parallel lines along the middle of the muscle to show the fibers. The origin of this muscle will be the ilium or the hip bone. More technically, the point is the anterior superior iliac spine of the pelvic bone. You can mark this point with a clay dot. And then the point of insertion is on the proximal tibia. So place a line of clay there. Now placing the muscle. Attach it first at the ilium or hip and run it down to the insertion point of the proximal tibia. The muscle goes behind the knee and then on a diagonal up to the origin on the pelvic bone. So the muscle makes an S shape. That is an artifact of humans' upright posture. The action of this muscle is to flex the thigh on the hip. The last muscle we will create is the pectoralis major. We will build this in 3 parts. It consists of 3 fleshy triangles of muscle. When making the triangles, roll out a large clay carrot and flatten it with your hand. The first triangle's perimeter is 3 by 3 by 2 inches. The second triangle's perimeter is 3.5 by 3.5 by 1.5 inches. You can also use the wooden knife to trim the triangles. Switch from using your hands to the clay roller to flatten your triangles. Roll out another carrot for your third triangle. Then flatten it with both your hands and the wooden roller. Pectoralis major is the muscle associated with bench presses and push-ups. And cut it with the wooden knife. The third triangle has a perimeter of about 3 by 3 by 2 inches. Now we will mark the origin of the pectoralis major along the rib cage. The first part of the pectoralis is the abdominal, which attaches to ribs 5, 6, and 7. The second part runs up along the sternum, and the third part attaches to the medial 2/3 of the clavicle. Attach these 3 strings of clay now. For the insertion point, you will need 3 very short strings. Place these 3 strings along the lateral edge of the tubercular groove of the humerus, working their way down to the deltoid tuberosity. Now we are ready to attach the muscle. The first part of the pectoralis major comes from the lowest point on the origin on the rib cage to the highest point on the humerus. The second part comes from the sternum and crosses over the lower or abdominal part, and then attaches to the middle line on the humerus. And the third part attaches at its origin on the clavicle to the lowest clay string on the humerus. So all 3 parts should overlap one another as they reach their insertion point of the tubercular groove of the humerus. You can see the muscle fibers run along each triangle and reach toward the tendinous point of the triangle on the humerus. This concludes our lesson on the skeletal muscles.